Hey, 42 here. Throughout history, people have tried weird and wonderful ways to stay healthy. The Aussies said that sitting inside a dead whale carcass could cure rheumatism. The ancient Egyptians used alligator dung as a contraceptive. Yes, really. The Victorians encouraged people to eat tapeworm eggs to aid weight loss. The Romans whitened their teeth with urine. Morning breath is bad enough, never mind piss breath. Yet, as long as there's been physical illness, there's also been mental illness. And as long as there's been mental illness, there's been a variety of highly disturbing, so-called treatments that make Harold Shipman seem about as deadly as a damp flannel. In the 1800s, the field of psychology began to emerge, and the idea that the brain should be treated differently than the body. Psychology soon diverged into three main schools of thought: phrenology, psychophysics, and moral therapy. Phrenology is a since discredited field which basically involves studying lumps and bumps on the skull to try and predict a person's personality or character traits. Scientists figured that the brain was like a muscle, and therefore, parts that were exercised more would grow more, and so bumps were a sign of well-developed brain tissue. Based on that logic, Jay Leno should be the smartest man alive. Phrenologists would map the skull into different sections, each responsible for a different attribute. For example, a bit above the ear could tell you how self-destructive a person was, and the very top of the crown was linked with confidence levels. In fact, the phrase, "you should get your head examined," comes directly from this practice. The problem was, scientists still had a pretty poor understanding of what parts of the brain controlled different aspects of our behavior, and so the therapy was dismissed by the mid-1800s. I mean, just look at this phrenological mental map. It looks like a paint by numbers of Gwyneth Paltrow's bullshit marketing terminology. Then there was psychophysics, which wanted to explore the link between the physical world and mental experiences. For example, how does light make something bright? Or how does sound make something loud? Wilhelm Wundt, who has the most German name since Volkswagen, is nicknamed the father of psychology by those who aren't so fond of Freud and incest. Wundt was a pioneer in this field. He would collect data by recording patients' responses to different stimuli, showing them different colours, for example. Wundt and his contemporaries assumed that if you could control the conditions in a laboratory, then you could control a patient's reactions. The problem is, experiences are subjective. For example, it's presumed not everyone sees colours as the same hue. Your red could be my blue. And then take music. Beethoven's Ninth fills me with wonder and serenity, but it turns Alex DeLarge into a quivering, feeble fetus. So in the end, psychophysics taught us a lot about how we experience things, but it didn't really tell us anything about why people experience things differently. Lastly, the Victorians practiced moral therapy. The belief that people with mental disorders could be cured by offerings of compassion, kindness, and dignity. Various religious groups, including the Quakers, argued that the asylum system needed to be reformed so it was more sympathetic towards patients, who should not be seen as raving animals and chained up, as was typical, but vulnerable human beings. Part of reforming the system involved redesigning the buildings in which patients were housed. This is the period where all those asylum hospitals you see in the movies like One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest and Shutter Island were built. Imagine grand buildings with gardens where patients could get some fresh air. In America, Dr. Thomas Story Kirkbride advocated the use of architecture as part of the cure, and not just a prison in which to hold the afflicted. So, he designed a blueprint for the perfect asylum. One that would enable patients to be classified by type of illness, but also enable easy surveillance, with ample sunlight and ventilation. Between 1845 and 1910, 73 Kirkbride Plan hospitals were built, and many still exist today. Now, moral therapy advocated that these institutions needed to offer a safe space for vulnerable people and should only be used as a short-term solution. But in reality, Budget constraints, overcrowding, poorly trained staff, and dubious psychiatric knowledge resulted in a very different system indeed. Most asylums functioned as glorified prisons, a place to keep individuals with mental illnesses away from their families and communities because they were seen as a threat. The problem was, anyone who exhibited slightly abnormal behaviour was deemed a lunatic, and as anyone who's ever endured reality television will tell you, the term normal is rather subjective, leaving the system wide open to abuse. For example, many inmates were simply political prisoners, people who'd expressed radical views and so were conveniently dismissed as mad and locked up. Women were particularly vulnerable to misdiagnosis and were institutionalized much more frequently than men. At the time, a woman's assets automatically passed to her husband upon death or incarceration. And so, lunatic asylums offered a nifty way to get rid of an unwanted spouse and make a quick bit of cash on the side. The law also stated that any man in charge of a woman, so a father, husband, or brother, could have a woman detained against her will, and many women who did speak out against female oppression were deemed as hysterical and dangerous by those closest to them. In 1887, a pioneering journalist, Nellie Bly, heard about the mistreatment of female inmates at an asylum in New York and decided to go undercover by acting insane to have herself committed to find out if those rumours were true. The following year, Bly would recreate Phileas Fogg's fictional trip around the world in a record-breaking 72 days, so it's fair to say she was prepared to go the distance. In the asylum, she discovered conditions more cruel and inhumane than she could have ever imagined. Patients were forced to consume spoilt food and contaminated water. They were tied together and forced to pull carts around like mules. Sometimes they were made to sit on hard wooden benches for up to 12 hours a day, and if they moved or made a noise, they'd be beaten. Throughout the night, she heard constant screams harrowing down the long, empty corridors. One woman repeatedly begged for her own death, whilst another bellowed "murder" over and over again. Bly also witnessed one of the nurses beating a patient with a broom handle for crying. Then they tied her up, covered her face with a sheet, and bound it tightly around her neck to subdue her screams, and placed her in a bathtub filled with ice-cold water. Nurses and orderlies then held her in the tub until she gave up struggling and lost consciousness. What Bly had witnessed was known as hydrotherapy, a common treatment for patients experiencing manic episodes. Doctors believed the shock of cold water would help to reset patients' systems. People were sometimes submerged in a bath for hours at a time, mummified in cold wet sheets, or handcuffed to a shower and sprayed with icy water. The Victorians were so convinced about the benefits of hydrotherapy, they invented all sorts of strange contraptions to give the consumer a good soaking at home. Like this rocking bathtub, which was basically your very own wave machine, or the bath of surprise, which could dunk you into ice water at any moment, and probably explains why most people don't like surprises. What shocked Nellie Bly the most was the fact that most of the patients she met were not suffering from mental illness before they arrived at the asylum, but many had since experienced grave psychological trauma because of these horrific treatments. Fortunately, Bly's report did lead to an investigation and improved conditions, but this barely scratched the surface of what was going on behind closed doors. Harriet Martino, a British writer who's known as the first female sociologist, wrote how in asylums, we see chains and straight waistcoats, 3 or 4 half-naked creatures thrust into a chamber filled with straw to exasperate each other with their clamour and attempts at violence, or else gibbering in idleness or moping in solitude. Which, to be fair, doesn't sound like a fun Saturday night. When you think of insane asylums, you might think of padded rooms and straitjackets, But actually, the Victorians were much more creative and crueler than that. They used manacles, harnesses, coffins, coercion chairs, and crib beds to confine and subdue patients. Some institutions forced patients to wear Hannibal Lecter-style muzzles. But rather than fava beans and a nice Chianti, they got freezing baths and a neck collar. Unsurprisingly, a very high number of people died in asylums. In 1829, William Scrivenger, a patient at Lincoln Asylum, was found dead from strangulation after being strapped to his bed in a straitjacket and left overnight without supervision. Doctors conducting the postmortems discovered a worrying trend in asylum deaths. Patients kept dying with broken bones and broken ribs in particular. To shed light on this, many former patients wrote letters to authorities about the abuses taking place, such as orderlies subduing patients by kneeling on them until they gave up. Eventually, an investigation in 1887 resulted in a new legal precedent that asylum patients who died with broken ribs should be treated as a manslaughter case. Subsequently, orderlies were taught to restrain patients more humanely. Now, given that people could be sectioned for just about anything and everything, asylums became overcrowded very quickly. So mental health professionals, if you can call them that, were under increasing pressure to come up with ways to cure patients quickly, to have them dismissed and thus free up room for the next unfortunate souls. This led to a lot of trial and error, which was, well, mostly error. One of the most downright bizarre was rotational therapy, which posited that subjecting someone to excessive centrifugal force should cure their crazies. Patients were spun round and round at high speeds in a circular motion, normally in a swinging chair, until they eventually calmed down and promised to obey the doctors, at which point they'd be released and allowed time to sleep and recover, as well as probably vomit and change their trousers. The pioneer of this so-called treatment was none other than Erasmus Darwin, Charles Darwin's grandfather. Erasmus Darwin was a physician, philosopher, and scientist, but unfortunately, he wasn't particularly good at any of those, and so wasn't taken very seriously by most. Probably because he liked to record his ideas in bad poetic verse, like some lovesick teenager, but it also didn't help that his ideas included such gems as excessive spinning to ease brain congestion. And yeah, nobody paid much attention to Darwin's crazy idea at first, but then an American doctor, Benjamin Rush, came along, who thought spinning the ever-loving shit out of mentally ill people sounded like a marvellous idea. Now, the aptly named Benjamin Rush claimed that rotational therapy had a calming effect on his patients. Yeah, well, let's face it, if you strap anyone into a spinning teacup for long enough, they'll probably pass out and calm down eventually. If the ice baths and human salad spinner didn't cure the old noggin, then Victorian physicians usually resorted to chemicals. These were administered in the form of tonics, a mixture of powerful and addictive substances that would make the FDA cry themselves to sleep, such as morphine, lithium salts, cocaine, and chloroform. Furthermore, patients who were admitted with syphilis, which was rampant at the turn of the 20th century, were injected with malaria without their knowledge or consent, because it was supposed by Austrian doctor Julius Wagner Jurek that malaria would kill syphilis within the bloodstream. To be fair, it did work to a certain extent in reducing syphilis. The issue was, about 15% of patients then died from malaria. Now, why does that not surprise me? I would love to say that mental health treatment improved after the Victorian era, but I'm afraid it was quite the opposite. Electric shock therapy was widely practiced in the early to mid-20th century. And in 1935, Antonio Egas Moniz invented the lobotomy, for which he was awarded the Nobel Prize in Medicine, but all it did was turn people into human vegetables. By 1951, 20,000 lobotomies had been carried out in the US, and other countries did their fair share as well. Funnily enough, it was the USSR who were first to outlaw lobotomies in 1950 because it was, in their words, contrary to the principles of humanity. Because, the Soviet Union was famously pro-humanitarian. Europe and eventually the rest of the world followed in subsequent years. And I think you'll all join me in saying thank goodness for that. But just to be safe, next time you visit your psychologist and he offers you an iced tea, just take care and watch what he's doing with that ice pick. Thanks for watching. You can now buy my new book, Stick a Flag on It, on Amazon, or get the audiobook on Audible. You'll find a link to both in the description below. Thank you.